Hello and welcome to this next module of our exploration of United Church doctrine. Before we turn to our subject for this week, I want to address a couple of questions that have been raised in the discussions or in emails to me that seem really important. The first question is, why are we so interested in doctrine? And that relates to why do we talk about and preach and teach doctrine? You see, doctrine can be used as a synonym with theology. And when we are talking about that, we are thinking in terms of our connection with the common tradition of the Christian church and the very specific applications of that tradition in our own church, which is the United Church of Canada. So, for instance, today we're going to be talking about the doctrine of ministry. And so we're going to be thinking about a theological understanding of ministry within the context of a living community of faith. Christian denominations hold specific doctrines, specific positions. And so it's important to be aware of the positions from which our own tradition works so that we can be consistent with that or challenge it creatively and accurately. Doctrine addresses the big questions of our lives, our relationships, our understandings of God, and faithful and questioning people have always brought their best energies to these questions over the centuries. Tradition and inspiration and fresh possibilities informed their responses to the dilemmas they faced, and dilemmas we often face as well. Doctrine addresses at least three important aspects of the Christian life. The first is what we would call formation in the congregation. Those who want to be part of the Christian community need to understand what the Christian tradition is about. They need to be schooled, if you like, in the meaning of what they are taking on. They may be new to the life of faith or new to our denomination or new to a specific congregation's expression of faith. On the other hand, there are many long-time members of the church who are also interested in learning about our faith heritage and what fresh perspectives may be emerging on it. And so we open church membership classes, or we call them study groups or reflection groups, or give them whatever label you want. We often discover that long-time members may outnumber newcomers, and sometimes we're left wondering, well, what are you doing here? You've been in church since longer than I've been alive as your minister. But they're hungry to know or to learn or relearn or re-explore some of these things which are basic to our life together. A second thought might be about ethical living. For those who want to live ethically as followers of Jesus, our faith tradition, our doctrine, forms a spiritual home. In its roots, the ethics according to which we lead our lives, the position from which we approach the world, they're all grounded in our beliefs. And the perspective of the church is different from that of the surrounding culture in North America and is growing increasingly different almost every year. And so we need to understand and teach the doctrine of the church because our faith tradition represents a particular spiritual home. Christian teachings and Christian values speak to our finitude, to the realities that we are stewards and not owners of the things of this world, the need to love our neighbors as ourselves. Our culture often teaches very different sorts of values. And we might also think in terms of the impact of doctrine on pastoral care, because pastoral care, writ large, is the way the Christian faith allows us to make sense of our lives, of our high points and times of crisis. In other words, it makes available to ministers in the pastoral care that we offer some grounding, some foundation on which to stand. There are pastoral reasons to help members of our congregations deepen their understanding of the Christian faith. For the past centuries, we've not talked much about certain core concepts like sin, let alone the overlapping concepts of human depravity. But recalling solid meanings of words like sin and atonement, of the sacraments, the church itself, would be useful to us. What do you do with the person who says to you, I'm not worthy to take communion. I don't deserve it. I know you talk about forgiveness, but that doesn't apply to me. What I've done won't go away. You decent people can go ahead. If you can be clear about our doctrines of sin and salvation and the role of communion in the Christian life, you can be very helpful to someone like that who may very well be in your congregation. So that the minister's calling is to provide for those who gather and worship the resources to enable their faith to inform how they live their lives and to enable them to make meaning out of the often confusing welter of things that occur in a human life. It's about equipping the saints. It's about the caring for souls. Now, if you're very fortunate, you may have people in your congregation who also share in that. Count yourself blessed. But the responsibility falls to us as ministers. No other professionals in society play that role, and it is a crucial one. We function in the community that we serve and in the wider church as stewards of God's mystery, if I can borrow a phrase from Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. It's always been an important role for ministers to play. It's increasingly important now as the divergence between the life of the church and the life of the society continues to increase. The other question that was asked to me was, what's the difference between how the United Church develops policy and how it develops doctrine? One of the answers to that question has to do with the amount of time involved. We can often develop policies in response to specific events or occurrences or situations in the world far more quickly than we develop doctrinal or change doctrinal stances. So, for instance, if there is a crisis in the world, often there may be policy already existing that needs to be looked at or restated. Sometimes there is a unit or office or group within the church that is charged with taking care of or giving attention to, for example, certain issues such as the environment, human rights, racial injustice, or specific areas of the world where we have partner churches, South America, Asia, and Africa, and so on. In the latter case, we are often guided by the views of our partner churches. And our partner churches on the ground may have very different take on how whatever is happening in their particular region, nation, or community affects people. And we have come to be guided by them because we want to be in solidarity with them rather than just dictating policy from the outside, from our privileged northern and western perspective. Doctrine, on the other hand, takes a lot more time to develop. Usually a change in doctrine arises in the following method, but this is by no means a prescription. Someone, a group, a congregation, somebody becomes aware of the way in which a doctrine impacts the life of a faith community. Now, often those impacts go dealt with only at the local level, usually by ignoring the doctrine, if we're quite honest. But eventually somebody or a group of somebodies get sufficiently concerned that they will raise the issue publicly. And so it will go through the process of, it used to go to the process of a resolution to presbytery and then conference and general council. Now it will be the region and the general council asking for a change in the doctrine. Assuming there is agreement all the way along through each of those courts, then what will generally happen is that the General Council will authorize a remit for the study, the General Council will authorize one of its committees, often the Interchurch, Interfaith, and Theology and Faith Committee, to prepare a study on the subject, to investigate the traditions, the practices, the understandings, the biblical foundations, and so on. That committee will report back. If it's a quick matter, they might be able to report back in 3 years, but it's usually 6 years. And then the General Council, if it accepts the report and the recommendations of the committee, and the committee recommends some change in one of our doctrinal statements, then it will authorize a remit. A remit will take another 3 years before the subsequent General Council authorizes it. And then the doctrine changes. So we're looking at anywhere up to 9 and more years. Doctrine changes quite slowly. Policy, on the other hand, can change very quickly. We are much more nimble in policy changes and policy statements than we are in doctrinal changes, and I personally happen to think that that's appropriate. But that's the difference in how those two things may change, and those are just broad brush strokes about how that happens. It's not the full in-depth, but it gives you an idea. So this module, we are talking about ministry, the doctrine of ministry, not the practice of ministry, but the doctrine of ministry. And I want to begin the lecture by inviting you to stop the recording. Before you do that, please take a look at Article 18 of the Basis of Union. That's Article 18 of the Basis of Union and Article 8 of the 1940 Statement of Faith. And I want you to look, and there are lines in a Song of Faith about ministry if you wish to find them. I want you to look at those documents and ask, what are the similarities and what are the differences? So that's Article 18 of the Basis of Union, Article 8 of the 1940 Statement of Faith, and the appropriate lines in the Song of Faith. And take a look. What are the similarities and what are the differences about their understanding of what we mean by ministry? So please do that now. And so, what did you discover? Well, a couple of things. We note that the ministry is instituted by the divine. In the Basis of Union, it's said to be instituted by Jesus. In the statement, by God, but the impact is the same. The article in the Basis was amended at least twice. It was once to include men and women, and the second time to include a diaconal ministry. The statement of 1940 did not receive any amending because it's the articles in the Basis of Union that were the foundation for the polity section of the manual, at least until very recently. Notice a couple of things. Governance of the church is expressly reserved to Jesus Christ or to God according to the statements. None of the rest of us govern or rule the life of the Christian community. When we speak of human leadership of the church, we speak only of ministry. That is service to God in Christ and in service for the church in the world. Number 2, having ordained and diaconal ministry is not simply pragmatic, but it's an obedient reception to Christ's having appointed 2 such ministries. That it is Christ who appoints that there are 2 ministries is a significant claim. The United Church commits itself to a high view, in theological terms, a high view of ministry, which does not see those offices simply as practical or tactically self-serving. It's not just an organizational nicety on the part of the church. The church receives those orders of ministry as Christ's charge to it. A third thing we might observe. Not only is this ordering of ministries from Christ, so is the calling of people to them. Again, this is a high view of the ministry vocation, in which nothing less than Christ himself is seen as being the author of the vocation. Number 4, the role of the church vis-a-vis all of this is to recognize and choose those whom Christ has called to serve in the ministries that he has appointed. And the church can only do this in the power of the Spirit. And there is some significance to the role of the church in discerning the vocations in this way. Divine activity is present in both the call of the individual and in the charge of discernment to the wider church. Those two things have to come together. It's not uncommon that people will feel called to ministry and the church, for whatever reason, does not recognize that call as being to ministry in the united church or to ordained ministry or so on. That doesn't necessarily invalidate what the individual has heard, but there is duty on both sides to discern and decide. Number 5, without further elaboration, the article distinguishes ordination and commissioning. It signals that both of those are church acts in which individuals are dedicated to the work of ministry. The presence of the definite article reminds us that the basis does not cover all forms of Christian life and service under the language of ministry, as is typically done in recent times. So it's the ministry, the ordained ministry, the diaconal ministry. In more recent times, ministry without the definite article has been used to talk about the work of all of the people. And so we sometimes lose track of the distinction which was important for the framers of the basis. The basis distinguishes ministry from wider Christian discipleship on the basis of particular tasks to those persons who are called, recognized, and chosen. And so it is that ministry is a calling. To feel a call from God is a fine thing. To have that call validated by the congregations and other bodies of the church after testing is a blessing. And to know that the call comes from God and is blessed by God is both empowering and humbling. A person is in ministry because it is God's idea. And so pastoral ministry is a gift from God to the church. Service and love belong to God before they are shared with us. The word itself, ministry, commonly applies to the work that anyone does in the church, the ministry of Christ, the work of all the baptized, and we place a high value on the work of all members of the church. We do that quite rightly. The ministry of all people in the church that are offered to the community in engagement with the world or in personal connection. To quote from a Song of Faith, to embody God's love in the world, the work of the church requires the ministry and discipleship of all believers. And that's a more modern use. The word ministry is also used to speak about people upon whom the hands of elders have been laid, people who have accepted the call to the pastoral life. And in this module, when I use the term ministry, it's those folks that I am speaking of. We could call it pastoral ministry, we could call it paid accountable ministry. We could differentiate between ordained and diaconal ministry, but that's not necessary for our purposes today. In a different conversation, we would also have to talk about designated lay ministry, but I am deliberately and intentionally leaving that aside in this conversation. And so, with your permission, I will talk about ordered ministry, and I will simply use the term ministry. Ministry is a calling. Consider Ephesians 4:11-12. The gifts that he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ. End of quotation.